Captain Sarah Mitchell had always known she was different. Growing up in a small Texas town where football was religion and women were expected to cheer from the sidelines, she had spent her childhood with her nose buried in aviation magazines and her eyes fixed on the jets that occasionally crossed the desert sky. Her father, a mechanic at the local airfield, had taught her everything about engines before she could properly tie her shoes. Her mother, a high school math teacher, had drilled equations into her head until she could calculate flight trajectories in her sleep. At 17, Sarah had walked into the Air Force recruitment office with a determination that surprised even herself. The recruiter, a weathered sergeant with kind eyes, had looked at her slight frame and questioned whether she was sure about her choice. Sarah had simply smiled and told him she wasn't there to be sure, she was there to prove everyone wrong. The years that followed were a blur of training, studying, and pushing herself beyond every limit she thought she had. Flight school had been brutal, with instructors who seemed determined to break her spirit and fellow cadets who either ignored her completely or treated her like a mascot. But Sarah had persevered, graduating third in her class and earning her wings with a pride that no one could take away from her. Now, 15 years later, she stood on the deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford, watching the sun rise over the Pacific Ocean. The salt air whipped through her short brown hair as she performed her pre-flight checks on the F-35 Sea Lightning II that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. The aircraft represented the pinnacle of modern aviation technology, a single-seat, single-engine stealth fighter capable of vertical landing and takeoff, equipped with advanced sensors and weapons systems that made it one of the most sophisticated machines ever built. Sarah ran her hand along the aircraft's smooth surface, feeling the slight vibration of the carrier beneath her feet. She had been flying the F-35 for 3 years now, accumulating over 800 flight hours in the aircraft. Every mission had been a test, every landing a statement, every takeoff a declaration that she belonged here among the elite pilots of the United States Navy. The morning briefing had been routine, a training exercise with Allied forces, designed to test coordination between different branches of the military. What hadn't been routine was the presence of Commander Jack Harrison and his SEAL team aboard the carrier. Harrison was a legend in military circles, a man whose reputation preceded him like a storm front. Tall, broad-shouldered, with ice-blue eyes that seemed to see through everything and everyone, he commanded respect through sheer presence alone. Sarah had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. Harrison had led successful operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and half a dozen other places the military didn't officially acknowledge. He was the kind of soldier that movies were made about, fearless, brilliant, and absolutely uncompromising in his pursuit of excellence. He expected perfection from himself and everyone around him, and he had little patience for what he perceived as weakness or incompetence. The tension between the Navy pilots and the SEAL team had been apparent from the moment Harrison and his men had stepped aboard. There was an unspoken hierarchy in the military, and special operations forces like the SEALs often viewed themselves as the elite among the elite. They trained harder, fought in more dangerous situations, and operated under conditions that would break ordinary soldiers. In their minds, they had earned the right to look down on everyone else. Sarah had encountered this attitude before, but it was always more pronounced when combined with the gender dynamics that still plagued the military despite decades of progress. She had learned to navigate these waters carefully, proving herself through actions rather than words, but she also knew that some minds were simply closed to the possibility that a woman could be their equal in combat situations. The morning air was crisp and clean as Sarah completed her external inspection of the aircraft. Every surface was checked, every component verified, every system tested. The F-35 was a marvel of engineering, but it was also incredibly complex, with thousands of parts that had to work in perfect harmony. One small malfunction could mean the difference between a successful mission and a catastrophic failure. As she worked, Sarah became aware of voices approaching from behind her. She recognized Commander Harrison's deep baritone immediately, though she couldn't make out the words. What she could detect was the tone, dismissive, slightly amused, the kind of voice people used when they thought they were being clever at someone else's expense. "I'm telling you, Peterson, this whole thing is a waste of time," Harrison was saying to one of his men as they drew closer. "Half these pilots couldn't find their way out of a paper bag without GPS holding their hand. And don't even get me started on the political correctness that's infected the whole program. Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but she continued her inspection without acknowledging their presence. She had learned long ago that the best response to such comments was to simply outperform everyone's expectations. Actions spoke louder than words, and her record spoke volumes. "You see that one over there?" Harrison continued, and Sarah realized with a sinking feeling that he was referring to her. Perfect example of what's wrong with the military these days. They're so desperate to meet their diversity quotas that they'll put anyone in a cockpit, regardless of whether they're actually qualified. The comment hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had heard variations of this sentiment countless times throughout her career, from instructors who doubted her capabilities to fellow officers who questioned her presence in their ranks. Each time, it stung just as much as the first, but she had learned to channel that pain into motivation. Sergeant Peterson, Harrison's second-in-command, shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I don't think what?" Harrison interrupted, his voice carrying clearly across the deck. "You think I'm being too harsh? Look at her, Peterson. She's barely tall enough to reach the controls, probably weighs less than the ordnance the plane carries. You think she could handle herself in a real combat situation? You think she's got what it takes when the bullets start flying and people's lives are on the line?" Sarah's hands stilled on the aircraft's surface. She could feel her heart rate increasing, feel the familiar surge of anger and determination that had carried her through every challenge in her military career. But, this time, there was something else, a cold, calculating fury that surprised her with its intensity. She turned slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. Harrison was standing about 20 feet away, surrounded by 3 of his men, all of them watching her with varying degrees of interest and amusement. The SEAL commander himself stood with his arms crossed, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth as if he had just made the most clever observation in the world. "Excuse me, Commander," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the space between them with crystal clarity. "Did you have something you wanted to say to me directly?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Harrison's smirk widened slightly, and Sarah could see him weighing his options. He could back down, pretend he hadn't been talking about her, or he could double down on his position. Given what she knew about his reputation and personality, she suspected which choice he would make. "As a matter of fact, I do," Harrison replied, taking a step forward. "I was just wondering how someone like you ended up in the cockpit of a $100 million fighter jet. I mean, no offense, but you look like you should be teaching elementary school somewhere, not pretending to be a combat pilot." The words were delivered with a casual cruelty that took Sarah's breath away. She had expected doubt, maybe even some mild dismissiveness, but the sheer contempt in his voice was something she hadn't prepared for. Around them, she could sense other personnel stopping their work to watch the exchange, drawn by the tension that was now crackling through the air like electricity. "Pretending?" Sarah repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "Is that what you think I'm doing here, Commander? Pretending?" Harrison shrugged, as if the answer was obvious. "Look, I'm sure you're very good at following directions and staying in formation, but combat flying is a whole different animal. It requires instincts, aggression, the willingness to put everything on the line for the mission and your team. It's not really something you can teach in sensitivity training." The comment about sensitivity training was clearly meant to be the final insult, the verbal equivalent of a slap across the face. Sarah felt something cold and hard settle in the pit of her stomach, a resolve so strong it surprised her. She had spent her entire career being underestimated, being dismissed, being told she didn't belong. But this felt different. This felt personal. "You know what, Commander," she said, stepping away from her aircraft and moving closer to where Harrison stood. "You're absolutely right about one thing. Combat flying does require instincts and aggression. It requires the ability to make split-second decisions under pressure, to adapt to changing situations, and to trust in your training and your equipment." Harrison's expression shifted slightly, as if he sensed that this conversation was about to take a turn he hadn't expected. "It also requires," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "the humility to know that you don't know everything, and the wisdom to respect the capabilities of your fellow service members regardless of what they look like or where they come from. Is that right?" Harrison replied, his tone now carrying an edge of genuine anger. Well, maybe you'd like to prove it. Maybe you'd like to show us all just how capable you really are. Sarah felt a smile tug at the corners of her mouth, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of someone who had just been given exactly what they had been hoping for. What did you have in mind, Commander? Harrison gestured toward her F-35, his movement sharp and aggressive. Why don't you take that fancy toy of yours up for a little demonstration? Show us what real combat flying looks like. Unless, of course, you're not comfortable with anything more challenging than a routine training flight. The challenge was clear, and everyone on deck knew it. This wasn't about military protocol or proper procedures. This was about pride, respect, and the eternal question of who belonged and who didn't. Sarah could feel the weight of every eye on the deck, could sense the anticipation building among the crew who had stopped their work to witness this confrontation. She also knew that Harrison was testing her, pushing her to see how she would react under pressure. He probably expected her to back down, to find some excuse to avoid his challenge, or to appeal to superior officers to intervene. What he didn't know was that Sarah Mitchell had never backed down from a challenge in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. Actually, Commander, she said, her voice now carrying across the entire flight deck, that sounds like an excellent idea. I'd be happy to show you what real combat flying looks like. Harrison's smirk returned, but there was something different about it now, a hint of uncertainty, as if he was beginning to realize that this conversation might not end the way he had planned. Glad to hear it, he said. Though I should warn you, I've seen a lot of hotshot pilots crash and burn when they tried to show off. Flying isn't about looking good or following the manual. It's about having the guts to push yourself and your machine beyond what anyone thinks is possible. Sarah nodded slowly, as if she was considering his words carefully. You're absolutely right, Commander. Flying isn't about looking good or following the manual. It's about having the guts to push yourself beyond what anyone thinks is possible. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the gathered crowd. The question is, she continued, her voice carrying a challenge of its own, are you prepared to see just how far someone like me is willing to push? The silence that followed was electric, charged with the kind of tension that preceded either triumph or disaster. Harrison stared at her for a long moment, his ice blue eyes searching her face for any sign of doubt or hesitation. What he found instead was a determination so fierce it almost seemed to burn in the morning air. Sarah turned back to her aircraft, her movements crisp and professional. She had a point to prove, and she knew that the next hour would either validate everything she had worked for throughout her career, or it would confirm every doubt that had ever been raised about her capabilities. Either way, she was ready for the challenge. As she began her final pre-flight preparations, Sarah felt a familiar calm descend over her. This was where she belonged, where she had always belonged. In a few minutes, she would be alone in the sky with nothing but her skills, her training, and her determination to guide her. It was exactly where she wanted to be. The F-35's engines began to spool up with a sound like controlled thunder, and Sarah Mitchell prepared to show Commander Jack Harrison and everyone else on deck exactly what a real pilot could do. The cockpit of the F-35C Lightning II was Sarah's sanctuary, her cathedral of glass and steel where she felt most truly herself. As she settled into the ejection seat and began running through her pre-flight checklist, the familiar routine helped center her mind and focus her energy. Every switch, every button, every display had its purpose, and she knew them all by heart. Outside, she could see Commander Harrison and his SEAL team watching from the deck, along with what seemed like half the carrier's crew. Word had spread quickly about the confrontation, and now everyone wanted to see how it would play out. The pressure should have been overwhelming, but, instead, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. This was what she had trained for her entire life, not just to fly, but to prove herself when it mattered most. Tower, this is Lightning 401 requesting permission for immediate departure, she spoke into her helmet mic, her voice steady and professional despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Lightning 401, Tower, came the response. You're cleared for immediate departure. Weather is clear, winds are light and variable. Flight pattern is at your discretion. Sarah smiled slightly at those last words. Flight pattern at her discretion meant she could design her own demonstration, could choose exactly how to show Commander Harrison what real flying looked like. She had some ideas, and she suspected they would be unlike anything the SEAL commander had ever seen before. The F-35's engine roared to life beneath her, 40,000 pounds of thrust waiting to be unleashed. She ran through her final checks with practiced efficiency, flight controls, instruments, weapons systems all showing green. Everything was perfect, just as she had known it would be. Sarah Mitchell never flew an aircraft that wasn't in perfect condition. Lightning 401, ready for departure, she announced. Lightning 401, you are cleared for takeoff. Godspeed. Sarah advanced the throttle and felt the familiar sensation of controlled power as the aircraft began to roll forward. The steam catapult engaged with a tremendous surge of force, launching her from 0 to 150 knots in just 2 seconds. The acceleration pressed her back into her seat as the carrier deck fell away beneath her, and, suddenly, she was airborne, climbing into the clear morning sky above the Pacific. For the first few moments, she simply flew straight and level, allowing herself to savor the pure joy of flight. This never got old, the sensation of leaving the earth behind, of becoming one with the machine, of entering a realm where only skill and knowledge mattered. Up here, there were no gender stereotypes, no diversity quotas, no political considerations. There was only the pilot and the aircraft, working together in perfect harmony. But she hadn't come up here just to enjoy the view. She had a demonstration to give, and she intended to make it memorable. Sarah banked the aircraft into a sharp left turn, pulling enough G-forces to test the limits of human endurance. The F-35 responded instantly, its fly-by-wire controls translating her inputs into precise movements that would have been impossible in older aircraft. She rolled inverted and pulled through into a diving spiral, building up speed as she descended toward the carrier. Down on the deck, she knew that Harrison and the others would be watching her approach. What they would see would be an aircraft moving at over 400 knots, diving at an angle that seemed to guarantee a catastrophic impact with the ocean. What they wouldn't see was the precise calculations running through Sarah's mind, the careful balance of speed, angle, and timing that would turn what looked like a suicide dive into a display of absolute mastery. At the last possible moment, Sarah pulled back hard on the stick and lit the afterburner. The F-35 screamed past the carrier at wavetop level, pulling nearly 8 gs as it climbed back into the sky. The sonic boom that followed rattled windows throughout the ship and sent a clear message to everyone watching: this was not a pilot who was afraid to push the limits. But Sarah was just getting started. She climbed to 15,000 feet and began a series of maneuvers that pushed both herself and the aircraft to their absolute limits. The F-35 was designed to be a multi-role fighter, capable of air-to-air combat, ground attack, and reconnaissance missions. What it wasn't specifically designed for was aerobatics, but, in the hands of a truly skilled pilot, it was capable of incredible feats. Sarah rolled the aircraft into a vertical climb, using the enormous thrust of the engine to defy gravity itself. At the peak of the climb, she executed a perfect hammerhead stall, allowing the aircraft to hang motionless in the air for a split second before falling back toward Earth in a controlled dive. She rolled left, then right, then inverted, putting the F-35 through a sequence of maneuvers that would have been impressive in a dedicated aerobatic aircraft and were absolutely stunning in a fighter jet. Down on the carrier, Commander Harrison found himself staring up at the sky in growing amazement. He had expected to see a competent but unremarkable flight demonstration, something that would allow him to make cutting remarks about textbook flying and lack of real combat instinct. What he was seeing instead was a display of aerial mastery that rivaled anything he had witnessed from the best pilots in the military. The woman he had dismissed as a diversity hire was throwing her aircraft around the sky with a confidence and precision that spoke of countless hours of training and an intuitive understanding of flight dynamics that simply couldn't be taught. Every maneuver was perfectly executed, every transition smooth and controlled, every moment calculated to demonstrate not just technical skill but genuine artistry in the air. "Holy shit," muttered Sergeant Peterson, standing beside Harrison on the deck. "I've never seen flying like that before." Harrison said nothing, but his jaw was clenched tight as he watched Sarah put the F-35 through a series of rolls and loops that seemed to defy the laws of physics. He was beginning to realize that he might have seriously underestimated Captain Mitchell, and the thought filled him with an uncomfortable mixture of admiration and embarrassment. Up in the cockpit, Sarah was in her element. The G-forces that pressed against her body were familiar friends, the strain on the aircraft's frame was carefully calculated, and every movement was part of a larger symphony of flight that she was conducting with absolute precision. She had trained for moments like this her entire life, had dreamed of opportunities to show the world what she was truly capable of. But, as impressive as her aerobatic display had been, Sarah knew that Commander Harrison would dismiss it as mere showing off unless she could demonstrate real combat applications. Aerobatics were beautiful, but they weren't necessarily useful in a fight. If she wanted to truly make her point, she needed to show him what combat flying actually looked like. She leveled off at 10,000 feet and began a series of tactical maneuvers designed to simulate air-to-air combat. The F-35's advanced sensors allowed her to track multiple targets simultaneously, and she used every capability of the aircraft to demonstrate how a real fighter pilot engaged enemy aircraft. She dove, climbed, rolled, and turned with the kind of aggressive precision that could mean the difference between life and death in actual combat. What made the demonstration even more impressive was that Sarah was flying solo, without the benefit of a ground controller or wingman to help coordinate her movements. She was relying entirely on her own skills and the aircraft's capabilities, making split-second decisions that showcased not just her technical abilities but her tactical awareness and combat instincts. The F-35's stealth capabilities were legendary, but Sarah demonstrated that even a stealth fighter needed to be flown aggressively and intelligently to be effective. She used terrain masking, altitude changes, and sudden course corrections to simulate how she would evade enemy radar and position herself for attack runs. Every maneuver was purposeful, every movement calculated to gain tactical advantage. Commander Harrison watched in growing silence as Captain Mitchell's aircraft carved through the sky with lethal precision. This wasn't showing off, this was a demonstration of combat skills that he was forced to acknowledge were extraordinary. The woman he had insulted and dismissed was proving herself to be one of the finest pilots he had ever seen, and the realization was hitting him like a physical blow. Sarah began her final sequence, a complex series of maneuvers that would bring her back to the carrier for landing. But, instead of a standard approach, she decided to demonstrate the F-35's unique vertical landing capability. The aircraft was equipped with a lift fan and rotating thrust nozzles that allowed it to land like a helicopter, and few pilots had mastered the technique well enough to perform it under pressure. She positioned the aircraft about 2 miles from the carrier and began her approach. At 500 feet above the deck, she transitioned from conventional flight to vertical hover mode, the aircraft's engine and lift fan working together to keep her suspended in midair. To the observers on deck, it looked like magic, a 35,000-pound fighter jet hanging motionless in the sky as if it weighed nothing at all. Slowly, carefully, Sarah began her descent. The vertical landing was one of the most challenging maneuvers in aviation, requiring perfect coordination between multiple control systems and constant adjustments to account for wind, weight distribution, and engine performance. One small mistake could result in a catastrophic crash that would destroy both the aircraft and potentially kill anyone on the deck below. But Sarah's hands were steady on the controls, her eyes constantly scanning the instruments and the deck below. She descended at exactly 2 feet per second, the aircraft perfectly stable despite the complex forces acting upon it. At 50 feet, 20 feet, 10 feet, she continued her controlled descent until the F-35's landing gear touched the deck with the gentleness of a butterfly landing on a flower. The silence that followed was deafening. For a long moment, nobody on the carrier deck moved or spoke. They had just witnessed something extraordinary, not just exceptional flying, but a demonstration of skills that few pilots in the world possessed. Captain Sarah Mitchell had not only proven her capabilities, she had established herself as one of the elite aviators in the United States military. As the engines spooled down and the canopy opened, Sarah remained in her seat for a moment, allowing herself to savor the feeling of a job well done. She had accomplished exactly what she had set out to do, not just to prove herself, but to educate anyone who watched about what real flying looked like when performed by someone who had dedicated their life to mastering their craft. She climbed down from the cockpit and removed her helmet, her hair slightly disheveled but her expression calm and composed. The crowd on deck parted as she walked toward where Commander Harrison stood with his team, her movements confident and unhurried. She had nothing to prove anymore, her flying had spoken louder than any words could. Harrison stepped forward to meet her, and Sarah could see the conflict in his eyes. The man who had mocked her just an hour earlier was now forced to confront the reality that he had been completely wrong about her abilities. The question now was whether he had the character to acknowledge his mistake, or whether his pride would prevent him from admitting that a woman had just demonstrated flying skills that exceeded those of virtually every pilot he had ever known. "Captain Mitchell," Harrison said, his voice carrying none of the dismissive tone it had held earlier. "That was quite a demonstration." Sarah nodded acknowledgement but said nothing, waiting to see how the SEAL commander would handle this moment. She could have gloated, could have thrown his earlier words back in his face, but that wasn't her style. She had let her flying do the talking, and now she would let Harrison choose how to respond to what he had witnessed. The next few minutes would reveal whether Commander Jack Harrison was the kind of leader who could admit when he was wrong, or whether his ego would force him to find some way to minimize what had just occurred. Either way, Sarah knew that she had accomplished her mission. She had shown everyone on deck, including herself, exactly what she was capable of when given the chance to prove herself. The silence stretched between Sarah and Commander Harrison like a taut wire, ready to snap at any moment. Around them, the carrier deck had become an amphitheater of expectation, with crew members pretending to return to their duties while obviously straining to hear every word of the conversation that was about to unfold. The morning sun climbed higher in the Pacific sky, casting sharp shadows across the steel deck and highlighting the tension etched on every face. Harrison's ice-blue eyes searched Sarah's face, looking for something: smugness, anger, triumph, anything that would give him a way to salvage his pride from the wreckage of his assumptions. What he found instead was a calm professionalism that somehow made his earlier comments seem even more shameful. She wasn't gloating or demanding an apology. She was simply standing there, waiting, as if she had all the time in the world for him to process what had just occurred. "I've been flying for 22 years, Harrison finally said, his voice lower now, stripped of the casual arrogance that had characterized their earlier exchange. "I've flown with Navy pilots, Air Force pilots, Marines, even some Allied forces. I thought I knew what good flying looked like." He paused, running a hand through his short-cropped hair in a gesture that revealed more uncertainty than he probably intended. "What I just saw." Harrison trailed off, shaking his head slightly. "That wasn't just good flying, Captain. That was something else entirely." Sarah remained silent, her expression neutral but attentive. She could sense that Harrison was struggling with something deeper than just professional embarrassment. This was a man who had built his entire identity around his ability to assess people and situations accurately, and her demonstration had forced him to confront the possibility that his judgment might be fundamentally flawed in ways he had never considered. Sergeant Peterson stepped forward slightly, his discomfort with the situation evident in his body language. "Sir, maybe we should." "No," Harrison cut him off sharply. "I need to say this." He turned back to Sarah, his jaw set with determination. "Captain Mitchell, I owe you an apology. What I said earlier was completely out of line, and it was based on assumptions that I now realize were not only wrong but inexcusable." The admission hung in the air like a physical presence, drawing surprised looks from the SEAL team members who had rarely, if ever, seen their commander acknowledge a mistake so directly. Harrison's reputation was built on his unwavering confidence and his ability to make accurate assessments under pressure. To see him humble himself before a Navy pilot, and a female Navy pilot at that, was shocking to men who had served with him for years. Sarah studied Harrison's face for a moment, weighing his words and the sincerity behind them. She had encountered many different types of apologies throughout her career: the grudging admissions forced by superior officers, the diplomatic non-apologies designed to avoid responsibility, and the rare genuine expressions of regret that came from people who had experienced real growth. "Thank you, Commander," she said finally, her voice carrying neither triumph nor condescension. "I appreciate that." But Harrison wasn't finished. The demonstration had clearly shaken something loose in him, forcing him to examine beliefs and attitudes that he had never questioned before. "Can I ask you something, Captain?" he continued, his tone now almost conversational. "How long have you been flying the F-35? 3 years, Sarah replied. "But I've been flying fighters for 12 years total." "And before that?" "Flight training, undergraduate pilot training, various assignments building up to fighters." Sarah's responses were factual and precise, giving nothing away about the struggles she had faced or the obstacles she had overcome. Harrison nodded slowly, as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place in his mind. "And, in all that time, how many people have questioned whether you belonged there?" The question caught Sarah off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because it revealed a level of insight that she hadn't anticipated from the man who had dismissed her so casually just hours earlier. She considered deflecting or giving a diplomatic non-answer, but something in Harrison's expression suggested that he was asking for a genuine reason. "More than I can count," she said honestly. "In fact, you're probably the most direct about it, but you're certainly not the first." Harrison winced slightly at that, but he pressed on. "And how do you handle it? How do you keep performing at that level when you know that half the people watching you are just waiting for you to fail?" The question revealed more about Harrison's own mindset than perhaps he intended. Sarah realized that she was getting a glimpse into the psychology of a man who had never had to prove himself in the way that she did every single day. His gender, his size, his commanding presence, all of these things had probably opened doors for him that she had to kick down through sheer force of will and exceptional performance. "You find your motivation wherever you can," Sarah said thoughtfully. "Sometimes it's spite, you want to prove the doubters wrong. Sometimes it's responsibility, you know that your performance reflects not just on you, but on every woman who might follow in your path. And, sometimes..." She paused, considering how much vulnerability to reveal to a man she had met just hours earlier. "Sometimes it's just love," she continued. "Love for flying, love for serving your country, love for being part of something bigger than yourself. When you really love what you do, other people's opinions become less important." Harrison absorbed this information with the intensity of a student trying to understand a complex tactical concept. Around them, the carrier continued its operations, aircraft being moved, equipment being serviced, personnel going about their duties, but their conversation had created a bubble of focus that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of military life. "I think I owe you more than just an apology," Harrison said finally. "I think I owe you an explanation." Sarah tilted her head slightly, curious about where this was heading. "I've spent my entire career in environments where physical strength and aggression were the primary measures of capability," Harrison began. "SEALs, special operations, combat zones where the ability to carry a wounded teammate or kick down a door could literally mean the difference between life and death. In that world, size and gender aren't just social constructs, they're practical realities that can have life or death consequences." He gestured toward the F-35 behind them, its sleek form gleaming in the morning sun. "But flying isn't that world, is it?" he continued. "Flying is about precision, intelligence, spatial awareness, the ability to process information quickly and make complex decisions under pressure. All the things that..." He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the direction his thoughts were taking him. "All the things that have nothing to do with how much you can bench press or how intimidating you look in a uniform," Sarah finished for him. "Exactly," Harrison said with obvious relief that she understood. "And, I think I've been applying the wrong standards to evaluate the wrong things. I've been looking at pilots the same way I look at potential SEALs, and that's not just unfair, it's stupid." The admission was clearly painful for him, but Sarah could see that it was also liberating in some way. Harrison was the kind of man who valued truth above comfort, and facing an uncomfortable truth about his own biases was probably preferable to continuing to operate under false assumptions. "Can I tell you something, Commander?" Sarah said, her voice taking on a more personal tone. "What you just did, acknowledging your mistake and examining your own assumptions, that takes more courage than any flying demonstration I could ever give. Most people would have found a way to rationalize what they saw, or to minimize it somehow. The fact that you didn't tells me more about your character than any reputation or war story could." Harrison looked genuinely surprised by her words, as if he hadn't expected grace and understanding from someone he had insulted so thoroughly. "I don't know if I deserve that much credit," he said. "I was an ass, and you proved me wrong. That should be the end of it." "Maybe," Sarah replied, "but it doesn't have to be. What if this could be the beginning of something instead of just the end of your assumptions about female pilots?" "What do you mean?" Sarah looked around the carrier deck, taking in the organized chaos of flight operations, the careful choreography of men and women working together to project American power around the world. "You're a SEAL commander," she said. "You have influence, people listen to you, your opinions carry weight. What if you used that influence to help other people avoid the mistakes you made today? What if you became an advocate instead of an obstacle?" The suggestion clearly intrigued Harrison, but she could also see him wrestling with the practical implications. "I'm not sure how much influence I really have outside of special operations," he said. "And, besides, wouldn't it be strange for a SEAL to be lecturing people about gender equality? That's not exactly our area of expertise." "Maybe not," Sarah agreed, "but credibility isn't just about expertise, it's about honesty and the willingness to admit when you've learned something new. People respect that, especially coming from someone with your background and reputation." Harrison considered this for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said finally, "I have a daughter. She's 16, and she wants to be a doctor. She's brilliant, probably smarter than I am, and she works harder than any kid I've ever seen. But sometimes I catch her doubting herself, wondering if she's really cut out for medical school, if she has what it takes to succeed in a demanding field." He paused, and Sarah could see a new understanding dawning in his eyes. "I never made the connection before," Harrison continued, "but I bet she faces the same kind of doubts and obstacles that you've been dealing with your whole career. People questioning whether she belongs, whether she's tough enough, whether she can handle the pressure.